we're going to start in Luke 23, verse 32. Scripture tells us this: 2 others who were criminals were led away to be put to death with him. And when they came to the place that is called the Skull, there they crucified him and the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. Verse 34 is where we're going to be really soaking in our time today. It says this: and Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And they cast lots to divide his garments. Jesus is at one of the worst moments of his life. He knows that the hours are counting down before he's going to take his final breath before he dies. These soldiers have beaten him to a pulp. They've mocked him. They've ridiculed him. And he utters these words: Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. We look at this story and go, man, those soldiers really needed that forgiveness. I mean, they needed that opportunity. But ladies and gentlemen, we also look at this story today and realize you and I need that same forgiveness. We've got the first category we're going to address is our guilt go-tos. So these are the things that we as human beings just have a tendency to do when we've done something wrong and guilt and shame enter the equation. We kind of go through this cyclically. So we do it pretty regularly. We'll do it anytime we begin to feel these things creep up. So here's the first step that we take when guilt and shame enter the equation. We try to bury it. We want to bury it, and we want to leave it far, far behind where we now want to go. Because it's much easier to try to dig a hole and put these things in the past and move forward. A lot of times people call this skeletons in the closet, right? We just don't go in there. I'm not gonna open that door. We shove it in. I don't want any part of it. And so this is the first step that we have a tendency to take is, I know I've done something wrong. I know I've made this mistake, but I don't want anybody else to know about it. So therefore, instead of addressing it, I'm going to bury it and pretend that it never happened. So when we realize that burying it isn't going to be the answer, we move to step 2, which is my personal favorite. We begin to blame others. We begin to blame others, because how much easier is it to blame somebody else for my problems? It's the best. I don't want to take any of the weight. I don't want to have to deal with what may come of this. So, this is your fault. This would have never happened if we weren't together. The best example of this can be found in Scripture. You could search far and wide throughout history. The best example of this ever happening in human history happens in Scripture, and it happens literally at the beginning of the world. And Adam says this in Genesis 3:12, and this is hilarious to me, and I hope it's funny to you too, because enough time has passed where we can laugh. Okay. The man said, the woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me the fruit of the tree, and I ate it. So Adam goes ahead and he blames 2 people. One, he blames Eve, right? You know, the girl, the woman that you gave to be with me, it's her fault. She put me in this situation. If she was never here, we would have been fine. So he blames Eve and he blames God. He looks at God, the creator of the universe, and says, you gave her to me, like you brought her here. If I would have just been on my own, we would have been fine. We often don't want to take a look in the mirror and address the problems that we have. And so the momentary solution, the momentary fleeting peace is to blame somebody else. And we get to the last stage of our guilt go-tos, and we become upset with ourselves. And this is when the weight of our decisions finally begins to sink in. And we begin to realize that we've done something horrific. This is the way that you and I process guilt. We look for every kind of alternative solution that we can find to push it on somebody else until the weight of it all makes us crumble. We weren't meant to live this way. Jesus also had a goal for our guilt. And it wasn't to try to bury it. It sure wasn't to blame somebody else. And it wasn't to carry that weight on our own. So here's the first step in Jesus' goal for our guilt. The first step is we acknowledge it. We acknowledge that it exists. The second step that Jesus wants us to take is to accept responsibility for it. So we've acknowledged that it exists, and now we have to do what I believe is the hardest step to this whole thing. We have to accept responsibility for it. This is where most people stop. This is where we want to stop the train on the way to forgiveness. Because accepting responsibility for our failures and for the things that we felt guilt over, there's a roadblock before we can move past it. And the roadblock is one word, and the word is pride. And then we take the third step in Jesus' goal for our guilt, and it's the greatest one. And it's where we ask him for forgiveness. We've acknowledged that there's sin and that we're guilty. We've accepted responsibility for it. And now we get to take the step of asking him for forgiveness. And with forgiveness, we can find freedom. Guilt and shame, man, there's shackles and a sentence attached to those words. Forgiveness is freedom.